If you're looking to craft a really good looking gaming PC inside the NZXT H9 Flow RGB Plus, then stick with me because I'm going to show you everything you need to know, including the wiring and setup of your all-in-one cooler, the wiring of the motherboard, the power supply unit, and Lian Li Strimer cables if you want to use those, and a lot more besides. I'm also going to show you how to do a push-pull setup on your radiator, if that's something you want to do. So a lot of different hints and tips, including how to install Windows and more. I'll leave timestamps down below so you can jump to the relevant points in the video in case you already know some of these things. But first of all, I want to break down the case, show you what's included as standard and the things that you need to know about it and the points of interest here. This is a really nice case and a really easy one to build in, which is fantastic. It also supports standard motherboards and rear connect motherboards. And I'm going to use a rear connect motherboard in this, but I'm also going to show you some hints around using a standard motherboard, so hopefully that'll be helpful as well. But it's really easy to build in, plenty of space in there, loads of room for additional storage, and as you can see, very spacious with the fans already set up for you. To remove the front glass panel, you first have to unscrew the thumb screw at the top of the case. The top also comes off in a similar way, with 2 screws at the rear and slides backwards. The rear panel comes off the same as the front with that thumb screw at the top that unscrews and then it lifts up. Now you can also remove the fan cover over here at the front with a small little screw on the top of that, and then it just slides upwards and comes away. This isn't essential, but it does give you access to the side mounted fans. If you want to then be able to put a radiator there instead, for example, you can then access those easily. Now, if you've taken off the rear panel, you'll see there are a couple of additional screws that need to be removed to take that SSD tray off. This also hides away a lot of the cable shame at the end, but there's a couple of very small screws that you'll need to carefully remove first to be able to access this area. I'd recommend storing them somewhere safe because they are very tiny and you don't want to lose them. This door will also pull out once you open it up, so you can actually take it out fully during the build process to make your life a little bit easier. It just hooks in at the top and then lifts up. Once you open that up, you'll see there's a lot of different cable management areas through here with Velcro ties along the side that you can then access to put your cables into. The accessories box is tied into the hard disk drive cage at the rear. I'm going to show you how to remove that cage because we want to be able to access the NZXT fan controller at the rear here, and I want you to be able to clearly see how to plug things in. Plus, we're not going to use this for this build, but you put hard disk drives in there if that's something you want to do, and there's instructions and manual on that. I'm going to show you how to mount SSDs later anyway. But you'll see the fans that are pre-installed in the case are already wired into this controller, and then it just has PCIe power and a USB connection that you need to make sure you connect up so that you can then control the fans and that they're powered. And I'll show you where to plug those in later on. I'm also going to show you where to plug in all these other cables, which includes things like the front power button, USB-C, USB-A ports, the HD audio, which is your 3.5mm jack on the front bottom of the case as well. And I'll show you the logic for how to plug those in and where later on. Inside the accessories box, we have a number of things, including various different screws nicely labeled in bags for you. We've got some plastic cable ties and more Velcro ties to neaten things up too here. You can see in the manual what all of these screws do, but I'm also going to show you where I'm using them and make it clear for you along the way. But you'll notice here, for example, we've got these CB5 by 10mm. These are for additional fans. I found that I didn't have to use these at all during my build, so you probably won't have to either. They've got a motherboard standoff, which is an additional standoff if you're using a different motherboard beyond ATX, and I didn't use those either. Then we have the motherboard and hard disk drive screws, which are the 632 by 5mm, and then the 2.5-inch SSDs, which is the M3 by 5mm. And so those are the screws that you'll need, along with these hexagonal ones, which are a 632 by 6mm. There's only 4 of those for your power supply unit. You also will get some with your PSU, undoubtedly. And then there's this little plastic cover, which is very small, and I'll show you how to use that in a second. Now, with that door removed, you'll also see that there's a note here about pushing the cover off, and I want to show you why. So with a standard ATX motherboard installed, which will, by the way, just sit in there really easily without having to worry about any of the additional motherboard standoffs, you'll see that you run your power cables through from the rear, plug in your CPU power connectors at the top here, and the way they nestle in there. And then to plug in the 24-pin power connector, you need to push out this side panel first of all. So there's a little plastic bit that you need to just push out from the rear and that will pop out. So just run your finger along there, pushing it gently until it pops out there. This is basically designed to hide the cables away if you're using a rear Connect motherboard. If you're using a standard motherboard, you have to first remove that to be able to push those cables through and into place. So the 24-pin power cable for the right-hand side of the motherboard, for example, pops in here, and then you'll see it's exposed from the edge there. You'll also need that space for other things, like the USB-C cable you can see me plugging in now, the USB-A connector, and then obviously data cables for your hard disk drives and SSD. You'll also need to run through to the front if you're using a standard motherboard. That then means that you have this large gap there. So that's what this little plastic clip is for. Basically, that seats back in place where you just remove that other one and goes to some way to hiding away some of it and maybe securing them. Not great there. But you also see that the other connectors for the front panel, HD audio and USB-C connectors run through at the bottom. They come up from the bottom quite neatly, as you can see. A lot of it's hidden away down there. So it's quite nice the way they've designed this to work with both standard motherboards like this and rear Connect motherboards as well, giving you a bit of flexibility in how you do it. But it's much neater if you use a rear Connect motherboard like this Stealth Gigabyte motherboard, where all the connectors are at the back, so everything's hidden away there, and therefore you can leave that plastic clip in place, meaning that the edge of the case that runs alongside the motherboard is then much cleaner to look at. You can see basically that it's nicely hidden away. There's a small gap along the edge of the motherboard still, but not as visible. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you now the setup process for everything else and how to set it up in the system so you end up with a really nice looking build. So stick with me for all of that. And I'm going to start by talking about the power supply unit and connecting it up and how to install it at the rear and where to run all the cables. And this is Corsair's RMshift power supply and the Pro PSU cable kit with some individually sleeved power supply cables that look really nice and are easy to install. I'm going to show you the setup and wiring of each of the cables you're going to need in this build, starting with the motherboard connectors and the 8-pin EPS power cables. So this is a modular power supply with the Type 5 connectors on it, which is a small connector on one end. And it installs in an interesting way because the cables end up at the top of the power supply rather than the side. You'll see what I mean by that in a minute. But for the 24-pin motherboard power cables, you'll see it split on one side into two parts, and then the right-hand side in my hand is the larger bit that plugs into the motherboard. So you're looking for the motherboard ports on the power supply end, and you put the two connectors into that. You notice there's a little plastic clip on them, so they can only plug in one way there. And also you need to watch out for where they pin into and plug in there, but make sure they're plugged in fully. And then once the system is inside the case, you then put the power cable for the 24-pin part into the right-hand side of the motherboard. I'm showing you it here outside the case so you can see it really clearly, so it's easy to get an idea of what that looks like and how you plug it in. Because what you'll notice is there's a little clip on one side that basically notches it on to a bit of plastic on the outside edge of the 24-pin power connector. So you need to make sure that's pushed all the way in and clicks into place, and there's a solid connection there. Otherwise, you might find that your PC just doesn't turn on. The other cables you'll need are the EPS power cables that are marked CPU on one end. The Type 5 part that you can see on my left-hand side there plugs in on the power supply end into the ports marked CPU and PCIe, which are near the motherboard ports on the left-hand side of it. And then the other ends plug into the top left of the motherboard. These are CPU power cables that help give your motherboard enough power for overclocking and things like that, but I would recommend plugging them in if you've got the cables and you've got the ports, to make sure you use them. You can see them here, and again, they've got little plastic clips on them, so you need to make sure the cables are pushed fully into those ports and click into place and hook over there. And that's the powering of the motherboard. As you can see, 3 power cables in this instance, and that's basically the same from the majority of motherboards out there, so it's pretty straightforward. Next, I want to show you the SATA power connectors for the SSDs and hard disk drives, and I'll show you where to install those in the case later on if you want to use them, but this is also useful for other things, as you'll see. These plug into the SATA/PATA ports on the power supply end, again with the small Type 5 connector plugging into those ports, and then the rest of the cable has multiple SATA power connectors on it, which is the flat power connector you can see here that plugs into the SSD, like this Crucial SSD, for example. These have an L-shaped connector on the inside of them, so the cable will only plug in one way round. Notice there are two connectors on this SSD. The other one is for the data cable that connects to the motherboard that you can see here. That's usually included with your motherboard, so you should find those in the box with the motherboard. You plug that in there, and then you plug the other end into the motherboard on the right-hand side into these ports here that you can see. Usually in the same sort of position on most motherboards, so it should be fairly easy to find. So that's the drive powered and connected to the motherboard. Again, as a reminder, this is all outside the case, so you can see really clearly where these things go, but you wouldn't actually do this just yet. Next up is the graphics card powering. Obviously, this is going to be different depending on the GPU you're using. I'm using an Intel Arc graphics card here, which requires the 8-pin PCIe power cables, and we need 2 of them. You'll see these power cables are marked PCIe on the end that plugs into the graphics card, and they're also split into 2 parts, a 6-pin and a 2-pin that need to go together to fit into these ports that you can see on the GPU, which are 8-pin, so there's 2 8-pin power connectors there. The Type 5 end plugs into the ports marked CPU and PCIe down the bottom right there, so you're looking for a PCIe connector basically on your power supply unit of choice. With Corsair ones, they're usually marked like this, and you can see how they plug in there really easily, but again, you need to make sure they're fully seated into those ports. Then at the other end is a little bit more fiddly, generally speaking, when you go to plug these power cables in. So it's split into 2 parts. It's a 6-pin and it's a 2-pin. You need to make sure they're pushed together and then pushed into the port. I find you can basically just notch those things in together and hold them tight as you push them in. You need to make sure these are fully pushed in all the way and neither part of that is loose, because if either of these power cables are loose during this connection, you'll find that your GPU doesn't get the right amount of power and your FPS might be suffering as a result, so it won't be performing properly. And obviously you've paid a lot of money for your GPU, so you want to make sure it's running properly. Those PCIe power cables are also used for other things in this build. We're going to need one of them for the NZXT fans. So just quickly, the single frame fans in the case are installed into this fan controller, which you can also get separately from NZXT in other builds. But you'll see that this has multiple ports in it with those flat connectors for those fans, as well as an additional fan and RGB connector at the top for the individual 120mm fans. So this thing requires powering in order to get the RGB power and the fan power to each of these fan setups. And in order to do that, you need a PCIe power connector, so one of those cables spare. And I'll show you how to plug that in later on. Now, if you're looking for an even more expensive GPU, an NVIDIA graphics card of the 40 or 50 series, chances are using a 12-volt high power connector or 12-volt 2x6 connector, which looks like this, which has these little tiny pins on it on one end, and the other end might be like this Corsair one where it's got 2 Type 5 connectors that plug into the power supply. So same sort of logic as I've just shown you. On the modular power supply, you're looking for the PCIe power connectors. So you can see on the bottom right here of the power supply unit, these 2 connectors plug in there, and then you've just got a single connector that runs to your graphics card. For the 40 and 50 series of graphics cards from NVIDIA, this is in place of the adapter that's included with the GPU, where you have one end that plugs into the graphics card with then 3 cables coming out of it, usually, which has the PCIe power connectors on it. So you've got this in place of it. It's neater, it's easier to plug in, and as long as it's firmly seated into the GPU, you shouldn't have any problems with it. You need to make sure it's pushed all the way in so that it clicks into place and none of the pins are visible or none of that plastic that should go into those holes is visible there. So you can see it's fully seated into place, and then you shouldn't have any issues with the powering of the graphics card there. Now, there's an important point of note here. If you're using the same setup as me with the shift power supply in this case, the power cable, the 12-volt high power cable, is a little bit too short to run to the bottom, so it won't run all the way to the bottom and then be able to plug in. You can see there's not quite enough length here, which is why I end up using the strimmer. You can come from the side, and I'll show you that later on, but if you want it to be really neat, you can't come from the bottom, unfortunately. So with all the cables plugged in that you're going to be using, because it's much easier to do that beforehand, you then go about installing the power supply. Make sure the fan is facing outwards, so this way around, so it can pull air through the rear of the case, and then you're going to use the 632 by 6mm hexagonal screws that are in this bag included with the case, or the ones with the power supply unit, to secure it at the rear. There are 4 screws there that just secure it into 4 different corners at the back of the case that you can see from this angle. You'll just tighten that up and secure those down, and then your power supply is popped in there. Now, I'd recommend trying to manage the cables to some degree here. I'd recommend making use of the Velcro ties at this point as well to secure the cables and get them out of the way so they're not a problem when you're doing the rest of the build. You'll also see that I've used plastic cable ties to secure the cables together so that they aren't getting in the way and just are really neat, or as neat as possible there. Next up is setup and prep over the motherboard, which is a stealth ice board or rear connect board, which I'm using with these things: Corsair's dominated titanium RAM, 9800X 3D CPU, and more. In order to install the CPU, we first have to lift the little lever and the latch there. Then we're going to seat the CPU into the socket. Note there's two plastic notches that you basically have to line it up with and gently seat it in. Take real care here. You don't want to drop it into the socket because there's pins in there, which if you damage will cause big problems. And then just secure it like that. Now, to install your RAM, you want to put them into the second slot and the fourth slot. So first of all, you press those little buttons at the top and bottom of those positions and then put the RAM into place. It needs to be second and fourth to make sure it runs properly and runs at the correct speed. Now, if you want to fill the rest of the slots, you can do as I am and use Corsair's Light Enhancement Kit. These are dummy sticks of RAM that basically slot into the other positions on the motherboard and have the same look as the dominated titanium RAM, but give you the RGB effect and obviously fill that space, which makes it look much nicer. And I'll leave links to these in the description. I'm also using Crucial's P310 NVMe SSD. Now, NVMe SSDs are the easiest to install and make it really straightforward in terms of adding storage to your motherboard. So basically, remove the little heatsink at the top and then pop it into the socket here. Now, these are sometimes screwed in place, those heat shields, but on this board it just has a little clip that holds it in place, and you'll find additional ports lower down as well under a heat shield. Make sure you remove the sticker from the thermal pad and then reseat the heat shield over the top. You apply this logic and any other drives you're also installing in there if you want to put additional ones in, and then we slot the motherboard into the case, seating it down over the standoffs carefully into position there. Then you'll use the 632 by 5mm screws to secure your motherboard to the standoffs in the case. Now, on this board, because it's a stealth board, everything's hidden under panels, so you first have to remove the panels and then screw them in. But any motherboard you're using, you should find you have 3 screws that need to be screwed across the bottom, 2 across the middle, and then 3 across the top as well. So you have to look under each of the panels to be able to find these, but you basically want to make sure the motherboard's properly secured. And once that's done, you can then put that panel back on at the bottom. You'll see there, when I lifted that panel, that's where you'd access the ports for other M2 NVMe SSDs as well if you wanted to install more on there. But then on the top right, there's another one, magnetic shielding, that holds that in place, and top left as well, just to secure the rest of the screws into those positions. Pretty straightforward, and it is worth using one of these rear connect stealth motherboards because it ends up looking really clean, as you can see, because you can hide all that away afterwards. Then for the powering of this board and running the cables, I've already shown you this with the power supply unit setup guide earlier on, but now I want to show you where these positions are on the rear connect motherboard because it's slightly different. So this motherboard only has one CPU power connector on it. So I'm running that cable through the Velcro tie so I can keep it nice and neat, and then plugging it in on the top right there. I found this a little bit fiddly because of the way it sits along the top of the motherboard, but you just need to make sure the plastic clip lines up with it. You push it in place and then it hooks into that port and clicks into place. And then basically just tidying that cable up and running it through the upper edge there, using the Velcro ties to tie it down and neaten it up so it's out of the way of the other things we're going to be plugging in. That's one of the problems for using a rear connect motherboard, is you need to make sure all the other ports you're going to be plugging in aren't blocked by any cables you're using. So the next one is for the 24-pin power cable, which you can see is on the left here. And you just plug that in, push the cable into place until it clicks. And then you've got to sort that one out as well because there's a lot of additional cable there that needs to be tidied up. So you have a choice in where you do that. You can either bunch it up and put it under the Velcro ties on the left there, or run it across the top maybe. Because a lot of it is well hidden from the front, you've got plenty of space here to sort of work out the best way to do this for you. But this is going to vary depending on the power supply you're using. These power supply cables from Corsair are really nice and easy to manage in a neat way, but some 24-pin power cables are a bit thicker and harder to deal with. And then I'm going to show you the connectors for the front panel connections. So USB-A, USB-C, HD audio, and front panel. We'll start with USB-A, which is on the right here, and USB-C, which is that silver one on the left. These cables will only plug in one way on the ports, so you have to watch out for this. But the port on this motherboard is down the bottom left here. It has a little plastic notch on one side of it, which is where the cable plugs into. So just have to make sure it's plugged in properly because you can only plug it in one direction. And then there's a lot of excess cable that I basically ended up hiding on the left-hand side here. Again, doing this makes it a lot easier to access the other ports and make sure you can easily plug things in. And then we have the USB-C connection, which is just above that, just above the SATA ports where you plug in your SSDs. And you can see it here, just for a closer view of that. And that also will only plug in one way round. So you have to push it in until it clicks into place. If you don't feel the click, then you probably got it in the wrong way around and it won't work properly. Then the front panel connection, which on the rear Connect motherboard plugs in the bottom left. And you'll see it has one pin missing from it. Now this port is actually a bit wider because you can see it's also got speaker and power LED on the left-hand side of it. But you need to plug it in on the right-hand side where the power and reset switch pins are. So you need to plug it in on that side there, and that's how that's secured. And again, then just neaten those cables out of the way and run them in a way that just gets them out of the way of other things without accidentally pulling it out of the port, because it will be easy to do that. And then the HD audio goes on the opposite side, on the right-hand side. Again, this is also missing a pin. So a lot of these cables can only be plugged in one way, so don't try and force them, but you should find if you look closely, you've got an F audio panel or HD audio port on your motherboard. You want to find that and plug it in there. Choose the opposite side to the front panel connection, and then that cable's sorted out as well. And then for the PCIe power, which I mentioned earlier on, for the fan controller, this is an 8-pin PCIe power cable, which is the same one you use for standard graphics cards. So you need to make sure you've got a spare one of these on your power supply unit, and that you can then use that to plug this in. This is essential, otherwise your fans won't work properly. So make sure you have one spare. Then you have to have a USB connection from that as well that runs to the bottom middle of the motherboard to the USB ports. This allows you to control the fan speed and RGB lighting from NZXT's Cam software. And I'll show you that at the end of the video. Now, for this build, I'm using the Kraken Elite 420 RGB. You can use the Kraken Elite 420 on the top of the case, or theoretically on the side. Obviously, you could use smaller ones if you want to. A 360 or 240mm is also possible to mount in this build. But I want to show you the setup and wiring of this with AMD CPU and how you'd plug everything in, how you connect it all up. Again, just like the case, this is actually pretty straightforward, and that's one of the nice things about these NZXT products. It comes with a single frame fan, the same as the case does, so it maintains that same aesthetic. And you have the option to install this as intake or exhaust, depending on what you're doing. Now, you'll find a lot of accessories in the box because it works with both Intel and AMD setups. So we can get rid of the Intel things and just stick to the AMD things for this build. But this is what the Intel backplate looks like, and the standoffs for that, and it will work with a lot of different motherboards. I'm using it with an AM5 socket motherboard, and we have to do some prep on the motherboard that I'll show you in a second first of all. Because we're top mounting this radiator, we install the fans on the rad like this, so that they're facing down into the case. That will be exhausting air through the radiator and out the top of the case. You then use 4 of the long radiator screws that are included in the box to secure it to the radiator. Notice the way I've installed it, when the fan cable is coming out on one side. This you need to bear in mind depending on how you install the rad in the case. So with the fans installed on there, we're going to look at the wiring logic of the rest of it. Now this is really simplified because you have a breakout cable that plugs into the radiator. So nothing comes out of the pump, it's all done through the radiator, and then the wiring runs through the system itself, which is really straightforward. So there's this connector that plugs in on the edge here. Now it is quite a fat cable, which becomes difficult to manage later on, but it does include a lot of different connectors in there, which you can see here I've laid out for you. We've got different cables for the USB connection to the motherboard, fan connector, which connects up to the fans on the radiator, CPU fan header that goes to the motherboard, and then SATA power to the power supply unit. So essentially the fans that you've connected up on the radiator, then plug into this breakout cable so that they can then be controlled by NZXT's Cam software later on, once you've got that set up and installed. And that's also then wired into the AIO pump header or CPU fan header on the motherboard. I'd recommend using CPU fan because you'll find your BIOS doesn't complain about not recognizing the CPU fan speed if you use that port. You'll see that the cable only has 3 pins. The port has 4, but don't worry, you can still install that there. Then you have a USB connection, which runs to the bottom middle of the motherboard. You should find you have 2 spare ports here. So you just plug one in there, plug that cable in, and that'll be sorted out. And then we have to do the prep for the installation, which involves, first of all, making note of these standoffs, the AM4, AM5 standoffs in the little bag there. Note that these are thicker on one end than the other. It's very difficult to see, but they're basically slightly thicker on the threading on one end, and that's the end that needs to go into the motherboard. But first of all, you need to remove the pre-installed standoffs and bracketing on the motherboard itself. So there's 2 screws on each of these black plastic clips, or the white ones you'll see later on. That you first of all need to unscrew and remove, and it's the same on most motherboards. You'll find that that's the setup there. Take those out of the way and then put the little standoffs in place instead. So the fat end, as a reminder, screws into the port on the motherboard, and do make sure you use that one, because if you use the other end by accident, you'll find that this is much looser than it should be, and this causes quite a problem, because essentially you just then got a loose cooler, and then you won't get as good cooling out of it. In my build, I'm aiming to put the tubes from the radiator on the left-hand side. I've been told by a viewer that they hate that, and it should be on the right-hand side. They prefer it that way around, so I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, you can see it's a little bit difficult to get that in, so putting it on the right might be a better option. You might prefer it, but one thing to bear in mind is how you've mounted the fans there, because you can see the fan cable's now on the wrong side if you do that. So you'd have to mount the fans the other way so the cable would run to the rear. But that's how it would look like that. Might look okay. I just didn't want to block the front fans. So if you want to put the tubes on the left-hand side, what I found you have to do is you first of all have to slide the 120mm fan down in the case. Loosen the screw slightly, move it down to the bottom, and then you should find that you can then install the radiator on the left. So now we can put the radiator on the left with the tubes there. Now it does press slightly against the housing there, even more so when you do a push-pull setup later on, but it doesn't get in the way of the fan. The tubes aren't touching the fan necessarily, so it's not like it's interfering with it and causing noise, but maybe it's not as visually pleasing, and you might not like that. Now, to secure it to the top, we'll use these small screws and washers that are included with the all-in-one cooler. They'll secure into multiple points across the top, as you can see. You line it up there, and then you're screwing those in so it's fully secured. There's a lot of them to do, so I'm skipping the process for that. But then you'd install those, and then we've got to run the cables through to the rear. So you'll notice there are some holes at the top that we can run the cables through, and I'm using the thin cable from the fan to run that through first of all, because we want to hide that away at the back. Obviously, it's going to plug into the breakout cable, as I showed you. The breakout cable is a little bit more problematic because it is quite chunky. Now, you can run this either behind the tubes or in front of that rear one, which is what I've done. It's not as easy to make this look neat, unfortunately, because it is quite a beast. But you can push it back through there and try and hide the majority of it away at the rear, so it just looks a bit nicer. Now, for installing the pump down over the CPU, first of all, we need to remove the plastic cap, and then take this standard bracketing off, because that's for Intel socket CPUs. And then instead of that, we're going to slot in the AMD ones, which are these straight brackets that you can see included here. So they slot in from the bottom and the top. You see you've got the tubes at the bottom of the pump here for reference. And then you just slot that into place so that those are secured. And then we're going to pop those down over the standoffs that we installed originally. You line these up with that carefully. What you want to do is make sure you put that in there carefully and don't move it around too much once you put it down in place, because you don't want to smear the pre-applied thermal paste all over the place and ruin it. Put your thumb screws over the standoffs and tighten those up. Do this by hand to start with. Go corner to corner so it's nicely secured into those 4 corners. And then I'd recommend using a screwdriver basically to tighten them up fully so that they turn until they won't turn any further, but don't like force it. Don't go overly hard with it, trying to tighten as much as possible. You just want to make sure they don't move, and so that they're fully secured there. And then you'll see that set up. The nice thing about this cooler is there's nothing coming out of the pump itself, so there's no additional cables there to worry about. And then you just need to adjust the tubes and the positioning of them. But you can see it just hangs over that rear fan a little bit. Maybe it's not perfect that way, but that's up to you entirely. Then at the rear, we'll plug in the cable from the breakout cable and the one from the fan, connect those together. And then don't forget the CPU fan connection. That plugs in the top left of the motherboard on a rear Connect motherboard. And then you're basically just going to bundle those cables together and put them under the Velcro ties so they're out of the way. And then the other additional connections that you'd have would run to the bottom of the case. So one is the USB connection, which connects up to the port. This is essential so you can control the display on the all-in-one cooler. We've got a spare port down here next to the one we plugged in from the fan controller. Plug that in, and then you have the SATA connection. So this is the same connector you'd use for your SSDs and hard disk drives. And we've got a cable here with multiple connectors on it. So you just plug that in there, and then that's powered. That'll ensure that the display works and the pump works and everything's getting its power. And then I just did a test boot to make sure everything was turning on properly. You see all the fans are running. Everything will start as white. You have to download NZXT's Cam software to get it working in other colors. Then onto the installation of the graphics card. So first of all, we need to remove the brackets from the left-hand side next to the PCIe port. So in this instance, with a 4090, I'm removing two of those. It's the second and third one down on the left-hand side. Pop those out of the way, but hold on to the screws that we took out of those ports. And then you're going to put your graphics card into the top X16 slot on your motherboard and plug it in there and secure it. So you're just going to push that in, line it up, and gently seat it into place, and then push that in until it clicks into place, and then use the two screws to re-secure it to the holes on the bracket on the back of the case, and that'll then help support it. Now for the power cable. Now I mentioned earlier on that the 12-volt high power cable for this is a little bit short from the shift because of where it's running from in the case. So what I found was that I couldn't run it from below. So it's just not quite enough length here. It just won't stretch, unfortunately, far enough to be able to secure in. And anyway, if it did, you don't want it to be this tight. You don't have that much tension on it. So the other option is to run it in from the side instead. Unfortunately, this removes the panel where you can hide away a lot of the cables at the rear with the stealth motherboard, so it doesn't look as good. It opens up that gap that we were trying to use before, basically to hide things away and keep things neat. But that's one thing to do if you do want to use the cable from the shift power supply to plug in there. You can do it that way. I'm going to use Lian Li Strimer instead, so I can still come from the bottom. It'll look neater that way. But this is what it would look like if you wanted to use the standard shift power cable. You can see that there's just that gap on the side now where you can see through to the rear, so it's not quite as nice. But it does end up looking good still, just not quite as tidy, unfortunately, and that's one downside to this PSU in this build. So an alternative solution to this is to use Lian Li Strimer cables. I'm using the V2 Plus, but you could use the wireless variant of this. I've got a link in the description to my setup and wiring guide on these cables, but essentially they're extension leads to the power supply cable. So this is a 12-volt high power connector that runs to that cable from the power supply and then just plugs into the GPU. It then has an additional cable that plugs into the 5-volt RGB header on the motherboard to supply the RGB lighting, or to a controller. As I mentioned, there's a full guide on this, and I'll link to that in the description. But this cable logic means that we're extending the cable length, so the shift power supply cable can be plugged in at the rear, and then the Strimer cable is plugged into that, and then you've got the RGB lighting sorted out and the power sorted out for the GPU as well. So the way this works now is there's a little adapter included that you can plug in that then converts the cable into a 5-volt RGB connection that plugs into the motherboard, and then that's controlled with your motherboard software. Alternatively, there's a controller that you can get for the Lian Li Strimmers, which will also be able to plug into that. Now, for the SSD setup, I'm using 2 SSDs in here, but you can actually put 4 on this rear tray. This is the tray that I showed you earlier on that you can actually remove from the case temporarily if you want to. I use the M3 by 5mm screws. This is for 2.5-inch SSD installation, and you can put 4 of them on this door. They slide in like this from one side, and you'll see that there's little brackets on the right-hand side, so they can't go any further than that. And then basically you use 4 screws at the rear to secure your SSDs into place. So make sure you line up the holes on the SSDs with the holes on the back, and then just use those tiny screws to secure these down. Now, obviously, these aren't essential to the build. If you're using M2 NVMe SSDs, then that's neater because they don't need any power. So you can install those directly onto the motherboard. But these are a nice way to add affordable additional storage and really straightforward in terms of the setup there, because they basically just mount onto this bracket and then secure really easily into the case there. And it makes access to wire them really easy as well. So the way this bracket works is there's one hook at the bottom that slots into a hole. And then at the top, you can see it just pops into place, and then you re-secure it in with those screws that I showed you at the beginning of the video. But you need to make sure you've got your SATA power connectors, which are from the power supply unit, plugged into that, and then the data cables, which are plugged in as well. So those should come with your motherboard. And I've got 2 in this instance, plugging in like this with a little silver clip visible there, and you'd press that to release them again if you needed to. And then it plugs into the port on the motherboard. There's 4 ports just below the USB-C port on this motherboard. We've got a cable for each of these drives, so you could have 4 drives plugged into this motherboard and plugged in on this tray like that. But obviously, you'd need to make sure you had enough power cables and data connections for it. And then you can just shut the door and use those tiny little screws to re-secure this. Once you're sure everything's plugged in fully, that will then hide away your shame, and then you can put the back door on. There's plenty of space back there, as you can see, even if you've not gone over the top with cable management, which I certainly haven't. And then you just secure that back on nice and easily, and then put all your panels back on, remembering the thumb screws that secure them into the various different positions, and then peel off any stickers that you want to get rid of. There's this one at the top there, for example, that tells you how to sort it out. And then pop the glass panel back on by sliding the bottom in first, push it into place, and then secure it with that rear thumb screw. We'll then be peeling off any of the plastic peel from the glass panels. You'll notice there's also a little caution triangle sticker on that glass panel as well, which you can take off. You might find some sticky residue on there that needs to be wiped off. And then you've got the finished build. So this is what that basic setup would look like. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to show you how to do a push-pull setup. So here you can see it with 2 420mm single frame fans on the radiator instead of just 1. This is obviously a bit crazy, but if you wanted to do it, you can. And I'm going to show you how. It's actually really easy to do. Obviously, it's an additional purchase. You need to purchase one of these 420mm single frame fans, and we're just going to add it to the radiator. Make sure it's facing the same direction as the fans that are already on the rad, so fan blades facing down towards the radiator in this instance. And then you're going to basically put it onto the top of the case. Now, you have to secure things differently. So I've taken the small screws off the radiator to remove it from the case, and then use the long radiator screws that come with the all-in-one cooler. They pass through the case, through the fan, and into the rad. So 4 screws, instead of all the other little screws that we were using before, go through that top fan that we put in there and secure it in place there. Then you've got the cable from the fan, obviously, the top fan. That has to then run to somewhere, and we're going to plug it into the controller. What I'd recommend is making a note of where you're plugging it into the controller, which port you're plugging it into, and then you can adjust it in NZXT's Cam software to respond to the CPU temperature or the liquid inside the all-in-one cooler. So that top fan will then spin up in a logical way to match the fan that's already on the radiator. So this is a great easy way to add additional cooling to your all-in-one cooler if you want to do that. And because there's a spare port on the controller, it's really straightforward to be able to do that as well. And I'll show you the setup and logic of that in NZXT's Cam software in a minute, but that's how you do push-pull. Now we've got the PC built, I'm going to show you how to get Windows installed on your machine and how to get Wi-Fi ready as well, and then on to using the Cam software. On a separate PC, search for Windows Creation Tool, and we're looking to create a Windows Media Creation Tool. And so go over to this website, And then you want this one, create a Windows 11 media installation. And then you open up the download, run the said download file. You need to have a separate USB stick for this, obviously, and a machine that you can do this on in the first place. Although you can do this on a phone. I've got a separate video about how to do that. And make sure you've got the right selections. And then you can see USB flash drive. It needs to be at least 8 gigabytes. And then click there. You can see that I've got a USB drive already set for this and plugged into this machine. And then you're basically going to run this tool and until it progresses and does a Windows media installation on that thumb drive. What you'll then do is insert that drive into the new PC. Just pop it into one of the front ports that we wired in earlier on and then turn the PC on, and you should find it then goes into the Windows installation process. So for what we want to do here is basically go through and select your relevant language and location and other things. So in my case, I'm going to pick United Kingdom, but you might be in the States or somewhere else. So go about doing that. Then click Install Now. On the next page, you'll see an option to put in your product key if you've got a Windows key. I don't have that just to my hand right now, so you can click I don't have that now. You can install Windows without it and then activate Windows later on with the key. So click Next, then click to accept the terms, and then you've got two options: Upgrade, which is to basically fix Windows installation if it's already there, and then Custom, which is the one you're going to want to use if you've got a new install. You should see the drive appearing here. If you've got a couple of different partitions on it like I have, you might want to delete those and format the drive. You should find that you don't have this if it's a brand new drive and a brand new install. But if you do, you can just do that, delete it, end up with one drive with unallocated space, click New, and then apply that. And what it'll do is it'll put multiple partitions in it. Select the largest one, so you can see partition 3, for example, has the most space on it here. Then click Next. It will then go about copying the Windows files and installing them. This can take some time, so I'm speeding up the process here so you don't have to watch the whole thing, but it does take a fair amount of time to go through this process. But at some stage during this, it will then go about installing features and updates. And then what you want to do is watch out for this next bit, because then it will basically say that it's going to restart the PC. So you can see it says restart. At this point, pull that drive out with the Windows installation media on it. Otherwise, it will try and reboot from that and you'll just end up stuck in a loop. So then it will restart and then it will go back into carrying on installing. But what it's doing now is basically installing it from the drive. So it's put some of the elements onto the crucial drive and then you just basically follow the rest of the steps. So go through there, and then eventually what might happen is you might get stuck on this section, which is connecting to a network. You might not have any Wi-Fi drivers installed. So what you need to do on a separate machine or on your phone, I've got a guide on this that I'll link to in the description, is head over to the relevant motherboard website, go to the support section, head over there and find the LAN and wireless drivers, depending on what you're using, whether you're using Ethernet or wireless. I'm downloading both because I want to install both of them, but it's up to you what you're going to install. And then obviously you need to open the folder on your PC or on your device. And then what we want to do is to put a blank or other USB drive into the spare machine that you're using to do this. And then what you want to do is make sure it's got no files on it, it's formatted and everything's deleted. And then what we're looking to do is to extract the files that you've downloaded for the Wi-Fi and LAN setup to that drive specifically. So for this MSI drive, for example, I'm extracting those onto there. And you can see it's extracted a lot of different files in there. So with the LAN drivers, I'm just going to create a separate folder so there's no confusion. Put a LAN folder in there, go into that, and this is for the Ethernet drivers. Right click on it and click Extract All, go to Browse, then select the USB drive and extract the files onto there. You can then use this drive on your new PC to install the files. So pop that into the new PC. Then when you're back on this network page, press Shift and F10 on your keyboard. And what you should do is find that then pops up a command window that looks like this. Make sure you click on it with your mouse and then type Explorer into there and hit Enter. And that should open Windows Explorer like this. You can then click on the USB drive and then click up the Setup and Install application. and just run that. So you should find there's an application in there you can run to install the Wi-Fi drivers or the LAN drivers or both. And once that's done, just minimize these windows, and then you should find that you've now got access to be able to connect to the network. So I'm going to connect to my home Wi-Fi network to carry on the installation process for this. So that's a pretty easy way to do that if you're having this problem where you can't connect to the Wi-Fi. I've got a separate guide that I'll link to in the description to show you how to do this with your phone if you haven't got a spare PC to be able to use, because there is a different way to do it if you need it. But once you've got through that, you should then be able to go into the next steps of finalizing the install, choosing the different options and other things. You might well find that you need to log into your Microsoft account, create one if you haven't already, or log into that to back up from previous PCs, or to create a new installation from scratch. I'm skipping a lot of steps here, but basically just read what's on the screen, select what's relevant to you, and then basically go about the installation process and finalizing that. You should eventually find that it then gets into this screen and then goes through a few more steps to install everything else, and then you'll end up with Windows on your PC. Now, once you've got Windows downloaded, the next thing to do is to download NZXT's Cam software. Cam allows you to control the RGB lighting on the fans in the case and the cooler itself. Go into that and you'll find a cooling section. From there you can set what the pump and fans are set to in terms of the speed. You can see as default it's set to silent, but from the drop down you can choose the temperature source that you want it to be based on, so the speed of the fans. Remember that I told you earlier on, for example, that you can make a note of the port you've plugged the additional fans into. You could set that to respond to the CPU temperature, and other fans in the system that are connected to that controller, you could maybe choose GPU from the list instead of CPU, so the intake fans on the case adjust to those instead. Then you can go into the lighting section, and from there you can adjust a few things. You can choose the display settings, so we can adjust between the various different options on the cooler. So you can choose single infographic, dual infographic, triple infographic. You can turn the NZXT logo on and off. You can adjust the lighting and the colors on the background and of the display. You can use GIFs and images on there. You can set it up and personalize it the way you want to, but you can also adjust the lighting of all the fans in the system here. There are various different default profiles that you can choose between and select, or you can customize it the way you want it. Obviously, for the strimmer I showed you earlier on, you're going to need to use your motherboard RGB software, but this will control everything else. So that's an in-depth guide on how to set up this case and the wiring logic of everything else. Hopefully I've helped you get to a nice build by the end of this. If I have, subscribe to say thanks and let me know in the comments if you've got any questions. Thanks very much for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.